I wrote an entire musical in just 4 days. Day 1, nothing. Day 4, an 18-minute fully written script. And the best part? It's actually quite good. Imagine for me that it is 2020, and we all remember what that time was like. It was not very promising, and yet. A theater I had worked for a long time and who had debuted one of my musicals already had approached me about doing a one-person George Gershwin show for the following summer and asked me if I'd be willing to both write the piece and perform it. Now this was in October of 2020 and the show was going to take place in the summer of 2021, which if you're looking at that timeline and working backwards, it meant that by the end of about April, I would need to have that show written, set, and frozen so that it could be handed off to the design team, production team, and get ready for pre-production that summer. Now here's where I want to give a quick caveat about this 4 days idea, which is I did not write the book and the music for this. It wasn't entirely George Gershwin music, but it was entirely pre-written music. So this is without music and lyrics. This is just the book, the script, the character, the development, the journey, all that big meaty stuff, which is actually some of the hardest stuff to get into in the first place. The score comes a little bit easier when you know the answers to all the other stuff and you've got a solid book in place. Although I grew up playing piano and I loved George Gershwin. I even played one of his preludes in a music competition in high school. There was a lot about him that I just didn't know at all. In October of 2020, when I said, yes, I'll do that. So I dove into the thing that I know a lot of us refuse to do early on in our processes because we want to dive into the exciting stuff, which is the writing and the planning and the doing. I set aside a whole bunch of time for research. In fact, not only did I dive into research about George Gershwin and his life and his music and his learnings and his inspirations, but I also got a very large, very meaty biography of him that was extraordinarily comprehensive, like well over 700 pages type of comprehensive. That was my study. But again, if we're looking at October saying yes, not knowing a lot about this man, having to write an entire show and develop it and get it frozen by the time April rolls around, we're talking 6 months. I had to plan this out. How much time could I even spend on research? So what did I do? I gave myself more time than I probably should have. Not that I want to should on myself, but at the same time, I let myself go all the way through the new year without writing a word, or even thinking about writing a word, or even planning. It was all just a research phase. In all honesty, looking back, I think a large part of that was because I was scared. I was scared of learning all the information. I was scared about what knowing all that information was gonna mean, how much more difficult that was going to make the show to write and to plan out. And I don't know, the nerves got the better of me. But any of you who know me personally will know that if I said I was gonna do something, I'm gonna do it. There's no way I'm backing down, and it's gonna be good quality. Gosh darn it. So I spent the rest of the fall through the holidays doing all this research and reading that gigantic biography, which was very good, by the way. It's very, very comprehensive. And then we got to January and I had to do something with all this info, which meant going back through all the research and hitting the highlights, pulling them, putting them into a space to look at and be like, okay, what do I want to do with this? What do I want to include? That I don't need, this I don't need, but these things, yes. And then I had this like plot of information and timeline through his life and inspirations and possible songs to include, and it was a mess. And here, my friends, is where I began to get a little bit nervous. We hit February, and I had done how much? Nothing. Every word I had written was just a summation of something that I thought could be useful to be included, but it was nearing mid-February and I didn't even have an outline yet. Now, when I had gone through the process of trying to schedule out for myself how I was gonna make this thing happen, I had said that by mid-February I would have that outline. So as February 13th, I believe, approached, that's when I sat down and thought to myself, uh-oh, okay, I gotta stop thinking about the D&D campaign I'm running and instead focus on this. That's a lot more important. Just focus, Gershwin, Michael Gershwin. I then thought to myself, well, you know what? It's still a pandemic. I've got a lot of time in my schedule. There's so much flexibility. I'll knock out this outline in what, 2 days? My friends, that was a foolish thing to think. 2 weeks later, I had dug through all of those pieces of information and put together not just one timeline, but two possibilities. And then I looked at both of those timelines, figured out which one I actually wanted to use, and then I had to take this gigantic thing that was pages and pages and pages long and turn it into an actual outline that's usable for writing a script. And even that outline was 4.5 pages of dense text. Now, originally, my idea was that I was going to be doing a reading of the first draft by mid-March, and unfortunately, I was not gonna hit that deadline just based on where I was. But the end of April was still far enough away. I could make this happen. Or so I thought. There I was, right at the cusp of February into March, and I finally had an outline-ish, almost. Sort of, kind of? Because what I realized that this outline did not include was any sense of the emotional pacing of the story with the song spotting. I knew what songs I wanted to use, I had that list narrowed down, I thought I knew what the placements were gonna be, I thought I knew what the flow of the story was gonna be, and yet, I didn't really have an idea of what the flow of this music was going to be like if I were to put that plan into action and write the libretto. So I dug back into the outline and I did a more specific song spotting process. Do you see how much time and planning I had done at this point? It was almost 2 full months of the planning period after doing all that research in the fall and into the winter. But I was determined, my friends, and luckily enough, I had just started the Spark Files Creativity Coaching Program, now known as Blaze, and thank you to Susan Blackwell and Laura Camion because they certainly helped me get my butt in gear and keep it in gear so I could get this thing written and written fast. But here I was looking at a calendar now that was only about 6 weeks between where I was and when this thing had to be frozen. And honestly, I had never done a development process that fast and I didn't have a script yet. You see the problem, yes? It's not just me? And that's when I decided to do what any sane person would do, no sarcasm at all there, and I plotted out when the readings would need to happen. It was scary. The last reading would have to happen by, it turns out, April 24th. And the previous reading before that, less than 2 weeks. And the previous reading before that, a little over 2 weeks. Now, if you're with me on this journey, that means that I am looking at all this information, tons of research, an outline that I think is going to work, now song spotted and for emotional pacing, and I've got 2 weeks to get a draft written and ready to be performed by me for a reading, which means I had to write this thing super fast. Sitting down and looking at my calendar, here's what I understood. I had 1 week, and 1 week only to write that draft. I'd kind of backed myself into a corner. I thought, well, never done that before. Let's go. Now here's the magic. All of that research I did, which I still had, which informed a beautiful outline that I was able to craft into a story just through the outline that had full character development along the way, now emotionally paced and song spotted through, knowing full well that this was going to be a complex story and an 80-minute essentially monologue with songs. I sat down to write that first draft, and I had already done all the work. I didn't know. It was magical. So when I actually began to take this chunk of text and put it into a story, turns out it wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. Complicated, yes, but since I did all the work, it poured out of me, and 4 days later, just 4, I didn't even take the entire week, I had a beautiful first draft. Now to be fair, I knew it wasn't perfect, I knew it wasn't ready yet, and that's what the readings were for, and I had those scheduled out, which was just a godsend, a pure godsend. For those of you who don't like scheduling things, I get it, I really do, but if you can schedule things or have someone on your team who can help you schedule things, I guarantee you things will go much smoother in the writing and development process. So here I am with the script, and I took a couple of those days that I didn't need in the week, and I went back through and I did some preliminary revisions, which was very, very useful, but I still had a lot of music to learn in order to do a first reading a week later. And so I kind of put it to the side for the moment. I knew generally generally what that large monologue was gonna look like, and I focused on music for a week so I could do the first reading. And the first reading happened, and it went well. Everyone was very impressed who listened in to how quickly that whole thing came together, and it was in decent shape. But I was lacking a major driving force and a major theme that I thought was there, and it turns out it wasn't. Even with all that research and a draft that kind of fell out of me, there was just these large pieces that didn't come across on the paper. Thank goodness for 2 weeks and a couple days before the next reading, because that's what I spent them doing, was trying to add those pieces in and make sure that it still felt smooth and natural. As it turns out, they were not smooth and natural, but they were there and they made sense logically. So, I did that second reading. I was getting a little bit better at the piano parts, because some of those piano parts are really hard. Looking at you, Rhapsody in Blue. And after the second reading, I got some really wonderful feedback, mostly from Sparkfile people. Thank you all again for your hard work and for being there for me when I just needed a little boost and some outside ears, because that feedback was invaluable. Even though I knew it wasn't quite there yet, they helped point the way for how I might get there. And then in the next couple of weeks, slightly less than 2, I was able to rewrite one more time and smooth the things out that I knew I wanted to smooth out, bring across those driving forces and major themes so much more clearly and in a way that felt integrated and interesting and led us through together, audience and performer. We do the third reading, and this one is actually with people on my production team and the head of the theater, and it went so very well. I made a couple minor tweaks in the 2 days afterwards, but at that point, it was frozen. It was done. It was time to send off and send in. Now that is an incredibly dense process, and I think just because of the pandemic pause, I had the opportunity to make that process happen. I don't know if I'd ever recommend that kind of condensed process to anyone else, or if I would ever do it again. I'm not sure. I had a lot of fun doing it, but I definitely felt the time pressure, especially coming into something where I did have to do a lot of research first and foremost. But I wouldn't have been able to make all of that happen, and certainly not at the level of quality that I was able to make it happen. The show went so well, so well. People loved it. I loved it. I still love it. If it weren't for the fact that I was able to do all that deep research ahead of time and specifically answer 6 question sets that were setting me up for success along the way. And if you want to learn more about those 6 question sets and how they can help you and your shows, then you should watch this video next. Otherwise, thank you all for being here with me today, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers!